I think we might get started if we can. Thank you everyone for joining us today for this TESS seminar on beautiful Jakimow, Wallaburri, Dingy country. I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Jakimow elders, past, present and emerging, and also to extend that respect to all First Nations people present today. Given this is a TESS seminar, I thought it would be good for us to recognise Jakimow's continuing connection to the lands and waters that surround us, and to thank them for caring for these ecosystems for thousands of years. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Kieran Sims. I'm a lecturer here at JCU in the field of development studies. I also lead a TESS research flagship, and that flagship is centred around capacity building and engagement for sustainable development. Part of the rationale for the flagship was to bring the social sciences a little bit more firmly into TESS's efforts to better understand and try and facilitate more sustainable, but also more inclusive and more equitable futures. So I'd really like to thank TESS, Bill and Yoko in particular, for their ongoing support of that ambition. Today I have the great pleasure of introducing the flagship's first TESS speaker for the year, Associate Professor Tanya Jakimow. Tanya is an Associate Professor in Anthropology. She's also at the College of Asia and the Pacific at ANU. She's also a former ARC DECRA Research Fellow and a current ARC Future Fellow. As a guest speaker, I would like to try and embarrass Tanya a little bit today. So I would also like to note that her highly impressive research track record has been achieved alongside a dedicated service to the field of development studies. So Tanya was the founding president of the Development Studies Association of Australia, for example, as well as a very, very generous giving of her time to advance the knowledge, work and careers of her colleagues, and especially early career researchers. Tanya's Future Fellowship focuses on the examination of women's political labour and pathways to politics in Medan, Indonesia, and Dehradun in India. But recently she's extended this research to examine representational practices in politics in New South Wales, and that includes an examination of the possibilities and barriers to political participation at the local level. So I'm sure most of you at least loosely follow politics in Australia, and you will know that questions around race, gender, Indigenous voice, a myriad of other aspects of representation have featured significantly in the lead up to the forthcoming federal election, and as they should. The stats on representation tell a fairly clear picture of a preference for white candidates, male candidates, and candidates from an older demographic cohort, and this preference persists in spite of growing calls for change. Representation and identity politics are popular focal points for mainstream media, but analysis of these issues is often quite simplistic, and today I'd like to welcome Tanya to deliver a presentation which will take us past some of this simplicity towards a bit more of a nuanced and a more complex understanding of political representation within Australia. So please all join me in welcoming Associate Professor Tanya Jakimow.
Thank you very much, Kieran, for embarrassing me right at the beginning. I hope that this talk lives up to some of people's expectations. I would also like to acknowledge the Jakimow people as the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I would also like to thank Dr. Kieran Sims and Dr. Yoko Ishida for facilitating my visit up here to James Cook University. It's my first time to your campus and I'm super excited and super grateful for being here. Thank you very much. Now, we are coming up to a federal election, and so I think it is timely to reflect on the makeup of our elected representatives, both in Parliament and also outside of Parliament. And that's what I'm going to be doing today. Now, I have to admit that this is I'm a little bit nervous about this talk, primarily because it's a talk that I'm in part rehearsing to present to the Gender Equality Advisory Committee in Victoria next week. So it is a fairly descriptive account of some of my early research findings from New South Wales councils. But I hope nonetheless there's something in it which has a little bit of meat for you to take away. And if not, I can expand on anything in the questions. But in terms of what we are going to be looking at today, first of all, I just want to lay out what is really at stake When we're defining the problem, what does the problem actually look like? I'm then going to present two kind of very broad areas where I think improvement needs to be made. And one of these is really just underlying what we already know, these issues that have been stuck in the too hard basket for too long, that we really need to come across and address if we are going to make improvements in having a better descriptive representation in our local councils. I also want to sort of, I guess, pull some of the emphasis or the focus away from these short-term training initiatives to playing the long game and working within gendered life cycles in order to get more women in particular onto local councils. I'm then going to very quickly, briefly go through a research agenda, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion. Basically, my argument is that progress has been too slow in getting elected representatives that reflect the population that they represent, and that we need a much more ambitious research and social agenda to address this lack of diversity. Okay, so let's start by first defining the problem. Now, the way that I have defined the problem is to look at what explains the continued overrepresentation of men of European ancestry in local government in New South Wales, and how do we increase the representation of women and people of colour. Now, I just want to talk through a couple of the key terms in here. But the first thing I want to do is just to emphasise that what comes first is the problem of overrepresentation rather than the problem of underrepresentation. So we're not just trying to fix those groups who are underrepresented. We need to look at the structures and the practices in place that facilitate the continued overrepresentation. Now, I've used European ancestry and non-European ancestry throughout. I also use white and people of colour. European ancestry is probably the fault line around which Australian politics most, tightly fits, and this is the terminology that's increasingly used among people working in this space. And it refers to Anglo-Celtic and other other white European people with that ancestry, to kind of suggest these are the people who have that social invisibility and who have that privilege of whiteness that allows them to move in particular spaces. In terms of people of colour, again, I know this is a problematic term. All the terms are problematic, but this is a term that I use in solidarity with my partners, Politics in Colour and Women of Colour Australia. Now, when we do start to look at Australians of non-European heritage and how well they are represented within politics, we can see that they're only, using this brilliant tool, they're only 4% of parliamentarians. So this is what I mean when I say that this is really the fault line around which underrepresentation is most stark. Jensen Kwok and Juliet Pearch did some analysis that looked at the proportionality index of different population groups and what was their proportionality index within the parliament. So proportionality index of 1 would mean that the percentage of the people within the broader population match the percentage of people in parliament. So if there are 50% of women in the population, there will be 50% of women in parliament. This would be a proportionality index of 1. Of course, we can see that they're not, and we can see that here where they have a proportionality index of 0.64. But if we look up here, we can see that when we're talking about Asian Australians, the proportionality index again is very stark at only 0.21. This is a very underrepresented community. And so this is kind of why I want to focus on their underrepresentation in particular. The other term, or I guess, you're probably wondering why we're talking about local government 2 weeks out from a federal election, but there are very good reasons to study local government in order to answer some of these broader questions. First of all, local government has a large number of positions available. There's over 1,200 councillors in New South Wales alone. And what this means is that even if only a small percentage of those councillors are, for example, women of colour, we still have enough people to learn from their collective experiences and draw some collective lessons from those experiences. And we don't have that at the federal and the state level, where we've got a handful of people and it's very hard to draw any conclusions from their narratives. Councils themselves are very diverse, so we have a broad diversity of institutional cultures, of political cultures, of rules and regulations. And again, this helps us to try to identify some of those causative factors for under and over representation. And local government is also often a pathway to higher levels of government. So understanding why people are not entering local council and then going on that pathway up to higher levels of government is also critically important. Now, New South Wales, I apologise, I am talking about New South Wales today. That's because I live in Sydney and this is the state where I do research. And we did have elections in December of last year. And so I did a lot of research on those elections. But I do mention Queensland in passing. Okay. Also, one thing that I forgot to mention is that, within these elections, the Office for Local Government, which is the government department that looks after local government, did have a big emphasis on getting a greater diversity of councillors. So they recognised that the majority of councillors looked a particular way. They were English-speaking men. Many of them were retired, and then very few were living with a disability. And so they wanted to increase more women, increase the number of women candidates, increase the number of people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds and people living with a disability as well. So they put in a lot of effort. And so my throat is really dry today, so I apologise if I'm coughing and croaking. So how did they do in these last elections? Well, actually, in terms of gender equality or gender equity, New South Wales did not do too badly in the latest elections. So we can see this on the map here that we have, these are all of the council areas that are in red, had an increase in the percentage of women councillors through the last term. So they went from being 32% of all councillors to being close to 40% across New South Wales. We also had some councils that had a majority female council for the first time, such as Newcastle, Cowra and Parramatta, which also elected their first female mayor. But when we actually drill down into the data, things are not looking so rosy. Now, the Office for Local Government collects a lot of statistics on diversity, but they do not actually distinguish between people who are white and people of non-European ancestry. So we did this data ourselves. We collected this data just prior to the election. And what we found is that, yes, we can see, men of European ancestry, obviously very overrepresented. But what is probably most striking is this very low number here of only 2.28% women of colour being elected councillors. And, across regional New South Wales, it's infinitesimal, it's really small. Now, this was quite an elaborate data producing exercise, and I'm happy to talk through the limitations of that exercise in the questions. And I did a much more kind of quick back of the envelope calculation for this presentation here to see how things had changed since the last elections. So what we can see down the bottom here is that if we have a look at the percentage, well, this is just in Greater Sydney, and I've just looked at Greater Sydney because that is where the greater concentration of people of colour live. So if we have a look, men of European ancestry back prior to the elections were about 34.25% of the population, yet they were close to 50% of councillors, and so they had an overrepresentation of 15.26%. And we can see that they are the only group that achieves their proportion of the population and the rest are underrepresented. Now, what is really interesting is that when we turn to 2022 and the new incoming cohort of councillors, we can see this dramatic increase in women councillors. So they've gone from being 30.9% to being 39% of councillors. And so this is 4.65% over-representation actually. But what we also find is that when we're looking at people of colour, men and women, that they have actually not increased. So if anything, they've gone backwards. These numbers are a little bit dodgy, so I wouldn't, put too much store to the fact that they've gone, that it's decreased. What really is the main point here is that when we're talking about improvements in gender equality, we're talking about improvements in getting white women into council. We're not talking about improvements in getting women of colour into council, or men of colour for that matter. Now, we broke this down for looking at more or less diverse areas of local government areas in Sydney, according to the Red Rooster line. I won't go over this, but I can turn to this in the discussion if you like. Or just suffice to say that the same holds within these more ethnically diverse parts of Sydney as well. Okay, so we wanted to try to understand why this is the case. Why is it so hard to address the overrepresentation of white men and why are women of colour still dramatically underrepresented. So this started with interviews with councillors, mostly in Greater Sydney, but also some in regional New South Wales as well. I then followed the candidates, 12 candidates or aspirants, not all of them went through to become candidates, in the lead up to the 2021 election. I participated in those elections. I attended workshops that trained women and also campaigned for and alongside women candidates. I'm also conducting ethnographic research across 2 councils, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and I'll also talk about a survey that we did. Now, I'm going to present some of the findings as I'm hoping to present them to policymakers, and this is really just to underline, the first part is really to underline a few things that we already know, but that we really need to start addressing in terms to overcome this problem. The first of these is the incumbency logjam. Now, one of the biggest barriers to getting a more diverse council, a more diverse set of councillors, is that the people who are in council at the moment are overrepresented as white men, and often they are not stepping down and ceding space for others to get forward. I'll just give you a second to read the first 2 quotes up here. Now, both of these councillors are in political parties. So quite a lot of LGAs within New South Wales, particularly in Sydney, they run along party lines. And so they're talking about the failure of people within their party to step down and cede space for the next incoming generation of potential councillors. But even when we're looking at councils which do not have party politics, we can still see the problem of incumbency and also what happens when some of those problems start to fade away. So I love using the example of Cowra Shire Council, which is 310 kilometres west of Sydney, which is in regional New South Wales, where they had pretty much the same set of councillors for decades. They'd have a little bit of, tinkering on the sides, but they were always, out of the 9 councillors, 7 or 8 of them would be men. They would come from large families in the area or well-known families. They would be from farming interests or big business interests. And there was a lot of consistency across multiple decades. Then in 2021, 4 of these councillors decided that they would step down. And suddenly we had 4 vacancies on council. Now, instead of having the 1 or 2 additional candidates that used to be in the election, so if 9 councillors are being elected, there would be maybe 11 or 12 candidates who would put their hand up. So you'd have surplus candidates of only 2 or 3. Instead of having only 2 or 3 surplus candidates, this time they had 16 candidates. So that's a full, 5 candidates extra. Now, out of these 16 candidates, 8 were men and 8 were women. At no other time had so many women contested. And when people talk about, okay, so why do we have so many women contest? The number one reason they say is that there were vacancies on council. So they thought that they would have a shot to do it. Also important is that out of these 8 women, 6 were elected. So they have a majority female council. And out of these 6 women, 2 come from the wrong side of town. So not only did they not fit the kind of, gender model, they also did not fit the kind of the dominant kind of big business family model, that typical councillor. Now, before we move on to the next issue, I do want to also just pinpoint what this mayor said, again from regional New South Wales. And he talks about the fact, he gives a different take on incumbency in that he talks about the fact that he would love to step down, but actually it's really difficult in good consciousness to encourage somebody to take on this role. And this is because this role is very poorly rewarded, it entails a lot of work, and it entails a lot of personal and financial sacrifices. Now, this gets onto the second issue that I'm going to be talking about in just a moment, but before I do that, and that's kind of low remuneration, but really the point here is that we don't actually understand what prevents men or any incumbent from stepping down, and we do need more research and kind of policy action in this particular area. Okay, so the second big issue that is well and truly in the too hard basket is remuneration. And I did have that conversation with the mayor just after I had sent out to all the participants the results of the survey that I had done with Politics in Colour. So, yeah, we had done the survey because, as I mentioned, low pay had been identified in the interviews with councillors as being a major issue that is one of the reasons why councils are not very diverse. Now, this was not even on my radar before these interviews, which in itself is really telling, because it talks about how in the literature this issue is just kind of, briefly mentioned and then moved on. It also shows that how in policy and in practice, with all of the effort to get a more diverse councillor body, remuneration is not discussed, even though it turns out to be really critical. Now, this is where I mentioned Queensland. So if you're here for Queensland, this is your moment. I just wanted to note that this is actually really different between Queensland and New South Wales. So I tried to find like-for-like councils and had the Queensland rates of pay and the New South Wales rates of pay. Now, you can see in Queensland we have almost a kind of a living wage in terms of councillors. So they are able to devote really full-time work to this particular role. But in New South Wales, we are looking at an absolute pittance. This is quite a very small amount of money, and it certainly means that most councillors have to either work in full-time employment or else they need to rely on their partners, or, as is most often the case, they are retired and so they have their own superannuation. Now, unsurprisingly, councillors in New South Wales are really angry about this issue, right? They get hardly any money. And so I think it was 80% of people said that remuneration was too low, and 57% of these said it was far too low and should be increased. Now, in our full report, which I'm happy to share with anyone, we identify 4 impacts of having inadequate pay, but I'm just going to focus on the last one, diversity of representation, as it pertains to today. Now, I'll just give you a sec because it's a bit of a busy slide and I need a drink of water. Okay, there's probably nothing really surprising here, right? Even one of the respondents in the survey said it is just common sense that if you do not pay people enough to do the particular job, the only people who can afford to do so are those with independent wealth or with superannuation, and that they look like a particular kind of people in the population. 70% of respondents said that the low remuneration rate had a negative impact on the diversity of people who could be elected, with women, people of low incomes and young Australians the most affected. But also people who come from migrant backgrounds also do have difficulty with the low rates of remuneration. And this is mainly because they do not have haven't been able to build up wealth over generations, particularly in housing. So being able to be a councillor and pay off a Sydney-sized mortgage is seen as a major barrier for young people in particular. The other graph that you see here is the percentage of respondents who said that due to the low rates of pay, they were considering not running for election in December 2021. Now, we've just talked about incumbency, so maybe this is a good thing that people are not recontesting for election. But contained within this number is women are overrepresented within this 24%. And according to research that came out of Victoria from Sandra Wilson, retention of women councillors is as important as recruiting them. So the fact that we're losing women councillors due to this issue is a concern. Now, these respondents had already done their calculations and they figured out they could afford it. So we did also survey aspirants. This is a very small survey. I don't think you can get too much out of the actual numbers. For what it's worth, 45% said that they were less likely to stand because of the low rates of pay. But really what I want to draw your attention to here is the question that was put to the then Minister for Local Government, Shelley Hancock. And this is in a forum for a Women for Election forum, which was trying to encourage women candidates to step forward for election. And so the person wrote in the chat, she said, I cannot forego the income that is required to stand for election. So are you going to do anything about increasing councillor payment? And the response by the minister, the then minister, was, well, you can devote whatever you like to the role. It doesn't have to be full time. You can manage it alongside your paid employment. Now, having spoken to councillors, this statement is false, if not deceptive. But why I pulled it up here really is because I want to demonstrate how This issue, which is just common sense, is being pushed under the carpet by these government organisations that are, purportedly trying to increase diversity. Okay, the final kind of issue in the too hard basket is racism within Australian politics. I'll just give you a few examples here. What was quite interesting is that the white respondents, out of the councillors that I spoke to, very few of them mentioned racism as a potential barrier to people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, whereas nearly all of the people of non-European ancestry did. And they spoke about the racism they had experienced in branches or, in the polling booths or in some of their, interactions with the public and certainly within the media as well. They often talked about how, even if they were born and bred in the area, devoted their whole life to it, they were still not considered Australian. And when I was standing on pre-poll, I heard some of these comments firsthand. So these two voters here were at the same pre-poll where they had one ward where 4 out of the 6 candidates were of South Asian heritage. And so the response was that, well, there's hardly any Australian candidates this election. Or there were kind of snide comments that, well, if he says he's talking about or representing his community, what community is he talking about? Now, these are some of the really tame comments. Some of the comments that were directed directly to candidates of colour were much more harsh and much more hurtful, I should say. Okay. So those are the 3 things that I think need to get more attention within our, when we're talking about diversity, if we're going to take it seriously. Let's deal with some of the things that we know we should be doing better. I'm now going to talk about some of the ways that we can slightly shift our focus in terms of what we do towards more long-term approaches and approaches that consider the gendered life cycle to increase diversity. Now, just very quickly, I'm not going to go over this in any detail. Just to suffice to say that most of the attention when they're talking about increasing diversity in local government centres around initiatives to provide training for underrepresented groups. And so a lot of, well, not a lot, trickle of resources is given to a number of organisations, and they do great training, and I've got lots of data on the benefits of this training, and I've also got additional data that talks about things that they could and should be doing to support candidates. But I want to take us away from the focus on candidates and preparing them for election and talk about more so how do we build up a larger cohort of women who are going to put their hands forward to contest in the first time. And there are 3 kind of big sort of approaches that I think we need to do in terms of this more long-term approach. And the first is to change our thinking around the compatibility or incompatibility of gendered roles and council. Now, the caring responsibilities of women are often seen as presenting a large barrier for women to enter council. This leads to what Andrea Carson and her colleagues have described as the missing cohort of women. So when they looked at women who joined Victorian councils, they found a missing cohort aged between the ages of 30 and 45. When they're in the prime of their child rearing years, these are the cohort which are not actually present on council. And some of the councillors that I spoke to also talked about this, talked about how, they actually delayed entering council until, the bulk of their child rearing years were behind them. And some of the aspirants that I spoke to also said, I'm not going to contest in this election, I'm going to wait till my, eldest goes through high school or what have you. But a lot of them also regret this as well because it truncates political careers, which has implications for pathways up into higher levels of government. So it's definitely a big issue. What's important though is that, the compatibility or incompatibility with these child rearing responsibilities at this particular point in time is less so that it's incompatible with council, because council can actually accommodate these very well. They have childcare, they have, remote attendance to meetings. So it's not that it's not possible to manage childcare responsibilities alongside council work, it's that women are doing too much. So they're juggling the house, they're juggling volunteer work, plus they're also in paid employment as well. And so it just becomes too much to add council to all of this. So this relates back to what I just talked about in terms of councillor remuneration. So if you increase councillor remuneration, then you're actually reducing that role strain because you're taking away one of those things instead of just adding to it. But that's just the material kind of conditions. So I am in complete agreement with Andrea Carson and her colleagues, but I do also want to talk about that while role strain may be one of the major factors deterring many women for standing for council, and the one that gets probably the most attention in discussions around it, women from some cultural backgrounds also face additional challenges due to cultural notions of ideal womanhood. So I'll just give you a second to read the quote on the right there, this one. Okay, so this is a quote from a Lebanese Australian woman who successfully ran for council, but she talked about how her political opponents would use her being a mother in ways to, diminish her and to kind of take away the opportunities that she was trying to get. So this occurred in pre-selection battles, and this is what she's talking about here. And she talks about how, this just plays into other forces which are trying to keep women of colour out. So it gives white men leverage to block our pre-selection by talking about these issues around motherhood in this particular forum. But this council also cops it a lot on council. So she was successfully elected, and the fact that she has children to look after is consistently raised in council meetings in ways that borders on outright hostility and has caused quite a lot of emotional anxiety, really. And this, again, is not unique to her. But the key point here is that there's no real, when we're talking about women's social role as mothers, we really do need to be talking about it in terms of multiple narratives and thinking about the additional challenges or different circumstances that some women face in dealing with them. Okay, but as these are kind of cultural and ideological notions of motherhood or womanhood, we can also start to challenge some of the narratives around this incompatibility between motherhood and council work. So the first way that we can do this is thinking about how being a councillor can actually be really complementary to other ways that women have to manage their career during their life cycle. So these are two female candidates. You needed to hear both of those, okay. The top one of these, she was a woman who took 6 years out of the workforce in order to raise her young children. During that time, she did a lot of community activities, and she was now hoping to re-enter the workforce. Now, rather than see council work as being incompatible with this ambition, she saw it as a way to formalise the kind of, the skills and knowledges and the program management and everything else that she had demonstrated through her volunteer activities and gain recognition for this in a more formal setting of becoming a councillor. It also helped her to gain access to a lot of the training opportunities in councils as well. And she was successfully elected, and that's just wonderful. The second candidate down the bottom here, she was an older woman, and she took time out to look after young children, returned to the workplace, and then she took time out to care for elderly parents and her parents-in-law. And in her re-entry to the workforce, she was facing significant ageism. Now, she'd pretty much given up getting a job, but the reason she said she wanted to become a councillor was because she felt she had so much to give. She had so much experience and knowledge, and that council was a way to actually get recognition for this. So the point here is that we can see some complementarities that can be communicated when we're talking to women and encouraging them to run for council. As I noted before, motherhood narratives are diverse and they are also cultural. And so for some women from ethnic communities, they talked about some of these complementarities in different ways. So this is a relatively young female councillor, and she was talking about how she was trying to encourage stay-at-home mothers to get into council by, underlying that they could manage this alongside their caring responsibilities. The second one is a really interesting one in that she is somebody who had taken on a lot of community work, which is a very gendered appropriate role for her. She's a Bangladeshi Australian, and how she managed to sell this kind of transition to council work by showing the complementarities between this community-based service-oriented work that she was doing and being on council. Which leads me to my next point. Okay, so this experience of this second woman from doing all this community service orientated work to going towards council can be one of the ways that we can build pathways from this community activism to council. Explaining that very well. Let me give you some examples. So there's a lot of women of colour in particular, particularly women of migrant communities, first generations Australians, who are very active in community activities, who are very active in community service and social activism at the local level. Now, if we are strategic, we can mobilise them to create these pathways into council. And we can see this is already happening in one particular council, that's Cumberland City Council, which is in Western Sydney, and is one of the most diverse local government areas in Australia. Now, it's been the Labor Party that has been particularly strategic in working with community organisations to identify community leaders and then mentor them, or creating opportunities for them to further their leadership skills. So, for example, they've encouraged a lot of men and women to sit on council committees where they develop the skills of, or they develop a political apprenticeship, if you like, that will then help them to get onto council in the future. And this is something we're actually doing quite a lot of work in Indonesia and Sri Lanka, in terms of thinking about all of these women who are highly active at the grassroots and trying to explain why they are not entering into politics at a later stage, and trying to think of ways, what do they need, and how do we extend what they already have, build upon what they already have in order to enter politics? How do we get their human capital to a point where they are able to transfer that into politics? How do we help them to extend their infrastructure? Obviously, I'm not showing you this to get you to read it. I was going to say I'd give you a second to read it, and I thought that would be cheeky, but all I'm saying is that we have this research and this framework which we are delivering to DFAT and to development agencies over the next couple of weeks, and this is part of an ongoing project which is also relevant in Australia as well. But for now, all I want to reiterate is that creating a cohort of women, especially women of colour who have the resources and motivations to join council, has to start early. We can't start doing this 1 year out of the election. We need to start identifying people much earlier in the election cycle, and 1 or 2 election cycles early. The intent should be to increase the supply of women candidates, not only train and motivate those who are already thinking of contesting elections. Now, this means that it takes time, it means that we have to cast a wide net, and it means that the immediate impacts of any programs will be also long-term and maybe not be quantifiable. So that's the message we're taking to donor agencies. The third area where, I'm going to really rush through this. The third area where we need to take a longer-term approach is transforming political cultures. So political cultures are in themselves very, they're of course dynamic, they are fluid, and they can change over time in ways that both maintain the status quo or that challenge it. Okay, well, I won't talk about election cultures. I can get back to that later if you'd like. I'll just talk briefly about branch cultures. One of the ways that councillors in particular identified that the status quo was maintained and the overrepresentation of white men was maintained was through having a really static branch culture. So these are the party branches. So here I'm not referring to the hostility and the bullying that occurs within these branches, although that's definitely a problem, and that's something that has to be dealt with. Rather, I'm talking about how the branches tend to be fairly masculine, and they also tend to be fairly Anglo. So, for example, branch meetings are held at night. They are often in locations where alcohol is served. A couple of the women of colour in particular talked to me about how the fact that they don't drink alcohol marked them as different within this space, and they were made to feel uncomfortable or out of place because they don't drink alcohol. This is one example where you have a party branch culture, which may seem fairly, mundane and not something we don't notice, but that actually has an exclusionary effect. The other thing is that I don't know how many people have been to party branch meetings. They're incredibly boring, right? And to try to get more people into parties people just get bored and they stop turning up, and that's what some of the other councillors talked about as well. They're not welcoming, and they're fairly, static. This is the way that they've always done things, and this is the way that they will continue to do things. Now, of course, in doing so, they are maintaining the status quo, right? They're protecting those people who benefit from having those very static branch cultures, or at least they're being non-reflective about how to change them to make them more inclusive. I actually believe that we need greater party participation in order to have a stronger democracy, and that we can really benefit from being a little bit more imaginative about how we run our party branches. It's also important to note that parties are still the way that most people get into politics. And so, a lot of attention is placed on independence and trying to get them through in the local council arena anyway. But we actually do need to look at party membership and how we get the party membership itself to be diverse if we want to make an impact. And one of the ways that we can do this is by embracing some of the diversity that we have within our own communities. So there are many different ways that we can participate in politics. There are many different political styles, many different political cultures. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is trying to learn from both India and Indonesia, some of their different political styles and how they engage women in party practices, and how we could use some of those techniques in Australia as well. Okay, I really do want to leave some time for questions, so I'm just going to very quickly run through what I am doing next. Okay, the first thing I'm doing is a comparative ethnography of two councils. One of these is Cowra, which I've already mentioned, which is a shire 310 k's west of Sydney in regional New South Wales. It has a population of only 13,000, and remarkably, it has an ethnography of it done by Ian Gray, a remarkable ethnography that was written about Cowra Council in the late 1980s, which just provides a wonderful starting point to look at some of the changes that have happened in Cowra. As I mentioned, their last election dramatically changed the council. Then we've had Cumberland City Council that I've also talked about. Again, in the last election, they had quite a large shift in terms of the councillors. They went from having 2 women to having 5 women. They have 3 Muslim Australians on council, and they have 3 people under the age of 35, most of these within the Labor team. And this is already having an impact in terms of the things that are discussed on council, but also in terms of some of the debates that are happening. So this gentleman here, Councillor Christou, who used to be the mayor, he's part of a faction within that council that is really trying to maintain Cumberland as a kind of an Anglo space. So that is fighting against some of the more progressive, well, I would call them progressive changes that the more diverse councillors are seeking to do. So what am I trying to get out of this comparative ethnography? First of all, I want to understand through comparison the different factors that led to the success in terms of electing a more diverse group of councillors, but then also trying to understand how this diversity actually shapes the quality of representation. The breadth as well, in terms of how many people they reach and what are the quality of those interactions. What's been really fascinating to watch is the forces of dynamism and also the reproduction of power within these spaces as well. Cowra has 5 new councillors, and they, the way that the incumbent councillors are able to control the status quo is remarkable, and that's another kind of area that I'm looking at. I also think that there's a huge scope to do comparative research across different local government areas in New South Wales and across different states in Australia. As I mentioned, remuneration is different across Queensland and New South Wales. This is a fabulous research opportunity to try to understand the real impacts of different pay rates. Anybody who's interested in the comparative project, please come and see me. But there are other things as well. There are different election cultures, which I didn't quite have an opportunity to talk about. There are different regulations and rules. Even, neighbouring councils in New South Wales will have different rules pertaining to elections, different rules pertaining to boundaries and so on. So how do these affect representation and diversity of representation? And then all of the different types of practices of political participation, what can we learn from different council areas? Okay, so, just quickly to tell you what I've just told you. So first of all, I just wanted to outline what the problem was and why I wanted to focus on women of colour in particular. I underlined that we needed to deal with some of the issues that are currently everybody knows about but nobody's dealing with. Take a longer term approaches to thinking about diversity, not just these quick fixes just before elections, and trying to work with and encourage dynamic political cultures. Okay, now as you might be able to tell this, I certainly feel it, like I've smashed a whole heap of disparate things in, and that's because this is from a number of different research reports and research outputs. Obviously, if you want any further detail, I can put you onto these resources here. But if not, I will just say thank you very much for turning up. Hope you got something out of that, and welcome any feedback and questions. Thank you.